I'm Carla Pestana. I'm a professor on the history faculty at UCLA. I'm actually the Joyce Appleby Endowed Chair of America and the World, which is my academic title, but as of today, I'm also the chair of the history department. If you think about the colonies that were created in the part of early America that becomes the United States eventually, each one has its own peculiar history. It's not a very centralized process of creating colonies. So different groups go to different places with different goals and ideas, and each one sets up whatever version they prefer. Some of them are in the Church of England, which is the legally established church in England, and which the monarch, if you asked him, would have said, oh yes, everyone in the colony should be a member of that church, but in fact, many people were not from the very beginning. So initially, most of the diversity was Protestant. That is, different versions of Protestantism. Some of them illegal in England, so it's not like that was not a big deal at the time. There were also Catholics right away in Maryland, and very quickly there were Jews, and although the evidence for this is much sketchier, there were eventually also Muslims. The diversity also comes from ethnic diversity, because people from all over Europe, or at least from different parts of Northern Europe, come to British North America, and they all have different variations of Christianity, at least. It wasn't that people came to America saying, we want everyone to be free to practice their religion. It was, in fact, that it was a process, and it had to be worked out, and some people died in the process of that being worked out. But over time, people became more willing to accept differences and more willing to compromise over having a variety of different religious groups. Now, all those groups are considered Protestant, and they're killing each other. So that shows you how radical this change was, that you could accept these various different groups. The case of Jews coming to America was really interesting, because Jews were illegal at the time in England. They'd been kicked out in the 13th century, but they were in other parts of Europe. In particular, they were in the Netherlands. They were in the Dutch-controlled parts of Europe, and they came with Dutch colonization to places like New York and to other places in the Americas. In particular, when the Dutch temporarily seized Brazil from the Portuguese, a lot of what were called Sephardic Jews, that is, they had been formerly living in Portugal or in Spain, but when they got kicked out of there, they ended up in the Netherlands. They went to Brazil, or their children and grandchildren went to Brazil. And when the Portuguese took Brazil back, they fled along with lots of other Dutch people, and they came into English colonies in the Caribbean, but they also came to English colonies in the mainland. And there were 7 synagogues of Sephardic Jews in colonial America eventually, that were the basis of the Jewish communities in early America and in the early United States. A really famous one was in Newport, Rhode Island. And there's actually a famous letter that George Washington writes to the Jews of Rhode Island, discussing with them their liberty to be in the early United States and to be Jewish, and that everybody is welcome to be in the colony. People from Islam came as well, but their presence was less known. They came as enslaved Africans picked up in the slave trade, and therefore they were carried to early America along with other slaving ports in the Americas. They came to the English-speaking areas of North America, and they were kind of hidden within the enslaved population. There's little fragments of information to demonstrate that they were there, but their slave masters didn't care about their religion, didn't know what they were practicing. They didn't leave their own records by and large, so it's very difficult to ferret them out, but we do actually know that they're there because we know who was picked up in the slave trade And Muslims, because they were highly educated, because they were traders, because they went on pilgrimage, moved around a lot, which made them vulnerable to kidnap and to being picked up into the slave trade networks. So we know that they went to a lot of different locations in the Americas, including the area that would become the early United States. So all the different diversity of religions that were in basically the Mediterranean world, Judaism, Islam, all different variations of Christianity, both Protestant versions and Catholicism, were all present in early America. And that's not even counting the religions of Africa that came that are not part of that nexus, or the religions of Native Americans who were already here, which people who came from came from England to early America tried to figure out Native religions, even as they didn't think much of them. They weren't very supportive of those people's rights to have their religion, but they were also very intrigued about, what do you believe? Do you believe in one God? Do you believe in life after death? There's narrative discussions, or actually dialogue descriptions of early colonists having conversations with Native peoples where they're asking them questions about, the origins of human life and what happens to you after you die, and making these records of what Native peoples believe. So it was incredibly diverse, and lots of different places that religion came from to come to meet together in early America. Well, there were individual colonists who were interested and asked questions, and reported on those, published those accounts. So we could find those, there's lots of them. Thomas Harriot, who's in Roanoke, does a big study of Native belief and has a description. One of the earliest publications about North America and English activity in North America is him describing Native peoples in the area that's, now the Carolinas. And conversations he had with them. There were a couple of kidnapped Native peoples who lived in the household where he was preparing to come to America. Sir Walter Raleigh had these Native men who came into his household in order, in part, to teach Harriet to speak the language. And so by the time he gets there, he's quite unusual in that he can converse with people. And does, and talks to them a lot about their beliefs. And we have his account of that. Also, somebody like Roger Williams, he spent a lot of time talking with Native peoples about what they believed and questioning them. And there's various published descriptions from the 17th century of people discussing Native beliefs with Native people and then describing them. Sometimes people will say, oh, they have no religion. And then they'll go on to say, they believe this, they believe that. It's like, okay, what they mean is they don't have the religion we recognize as religion, but they clearly have a belief system, and they have what scholars today would describe as a religion. So there's some of that. It's almost like early anthropology, where they're trying to question people and understand what their framework is that they're operating within. They think it's very important to believe in life after death. Because if you might get punished in death, that will affect your behavior. They actually think that's very important throughout the colonies as well, because they have no police. They have a very light ability to kind of detect crime, punish crime, track down people. So they figure the best way to get people to behave is to have them believe that they're going to pay for their sins later. So if you don't believe in punishment, heaven and hell, some kind of an afterlife, they think you're highly suspect. So that is actually one religious belief that the colonial government and the early American government and the early U.S., they believe society is only safe if people believe in hell. It doesn't matter if they believe in it from an Islamic point of view or a Jewish point of view or a Christian point of view, but they have to believe that there's some punishment for misbehavior coming later. Well, given this high level of diversity, it might seem that it's obvious that you end up with religious toleration, religious liberty, but actually that also was a process, and it had a number of different origins. So one place that acceptance of religious difference comes from is from principle. People had the principle that of liberty of conscience, that an individual should be free to believe what they believe. And that you shouldn't, they all talk about the danger of forcing conscience. But sometimes people who say that also want to restrict public expression. So you have some very, to us, funny descriptions in early New England where the upholders of what they consider to be Orthodox Christianity, who've created this new religious system and who are supporting it legally within their colony. You have to be a member of a church. You have to attend worship services. You have to be, you have to participate in this in the ways that they want you to. They'll say, oh, it's fine for you to believe what you want to believe, as long as you never mention it. So it's a kind of, it doesn't work, of course. It comes up because people do mention it. They do advocate for different versions. They do want to argue. So there's a principled basis for letting people believe what they want, but how you work that out in practical terms is difficult for some people. Somebody like Roger Williams, who's widely acknowledged to be an early advocate for religious liberty, was that, certainly, but he was that with a kind of a funny 17th century twist. He thought everybody was wrong, basically. He thought, all the different organized religions were missing something. All the churches he could possibly join were not quite right. And he was basically searching for the right answer for his entire life. And he joined different things, and then he dropped them. So he is this symbol of religious liberty, but he even can't figure out how you have freedom and then you also have community. So that's the problem. Like, how do you build a system that allows people to believe together, but also you don't force people? So that's something that's worked out over time in various ways in different places. One of the very good groups for working that out are the Quakers, the members of the Society of Friends, because they believe in principle not to do violence. When William Penn sets up his colony in Pennsylvania, they explicitly allow anybody to come who believes anything. And they can join any church they want. No one's going to check whether or not they're practicing what they belong to. Everybody is free to do as they please. And that's a very strong, principled version of everybody has liberty of conscience, and we just let community work itself out. You form the churches you form, you belong to the communities you belong to. We will have a Quaker meeting. You're welcome to come. If you don't want to, you can do your own thing. So that's a very pure, by the late 17th century, version of how to work out this tension. But at the same time, or as that's happening, the fact of diversity actually starts to make people think that you could have religious freedom and not damage society. That is, outside of having a kind of Quaker principle belief in letting everyone do what they want, people gradually in places like New England and in other places begin to see you can have these variations, you can have people that have different views, and you can still create a civil society kind of separate from that. And so in a lot of places, there's a working out of that relationship. So like in a place like New England, where they're very intolerant at first, eventually they're forced by the crown, by the government of Britain coming in and saying, you can't execute Quakers, you can't force people to be a member of your church in order to participate in politics. So they get some brakes put on their policy. But then over time after that, they work out that yes, in order to be involved in politics, you have to bring a note from your minister, but we're not going to tell you who your minister needs to be. So you could bring it from your Baptist minister, or you could bring it from your Quaker meeting or whatever. So they become willing to accept variations, and have all of those count within the public sphere as a way to become involved. So it's a long, slow process in a lot of different places. But another thread that contributes to this is basically what we would call the Enlightenment, the idea that which is an intellectual movement that supports ideas of individual freedom and individual ability to make one's own decisions. And so as people become, in the 18th century, more interested in thinking about, having their own control over their own ideas, etc., you can make a case that people began to see choosing one's own religion, having control over one's religion as a kind of matter of personal decision, and not something that the government should be involved in, not something that should be controlled by the government, that just individuals should be able to pursue their own views on this, and that it didn't hurt anyone for a person to believe one thing or to believe another thing. So that's another strand that contributes toward this, which is not to say that people do not fight vigorously, even viciously, about religious difference all through the colonial period, because there are moments, there are big battles. They don't kill people anymore, but they do fight out their religious differences, and they still take them very seriously. What happens, though, is when you get closer to the American Revolution, very practical considerations kick in. Because, as I said, the colonies are all founded with different religious systems, and they're all peopled by different groups. Each one has its own internal diversity, and the situation in each one is slightly different than the next one. Even in a place like New England, there's different variations in the different New England colonies. And if you expand that out and go all the way down to the newly founded colony of Georgia, you've got a huge range of variations in the colonial level. When you start thinking about having a revolution that's going to break from Britain and create some kind of unity among those different colonies, the religion question becomes impossible. What are you going to do? Like, some people think we should have an established church. That's what governments do in Europe. And everyone looks around and says, really? Which established church would it be? Like, Virginians would probably say, the people running Virginia would probably say Church of England, which is weird during the Revolution anyway, because it's headed by the English monarch. But even if we could get past that, what are they going to do in Quaker Pennsylvania or in Congregationalist New England? I mean, everybody is not going to agree across all these lines to have one established church. So what they say is, government will stay out of it. We'll basically separate church and state. We'll leave the federal government, we'll leave the overarching government that's going to tie all this together and create a new United States completely out of religion. It'll protect everybody's right to have their own religion, but it won't have any religious position. So it won't create any religious settlement. That leaves the decision local. It doesn't make it illegal to have a religious establishment in Massachusetts or to favor a particular church in a particular area. It just means the federal government won't say everybody has to be the same thing. And the reason why they do that is because if they tried to do anything else, there would not have been a new United States. There would have been different individual countries, maybe, if they could have organized, a war against Britain without being more coordinated, But if they could have succeeded in having the revolution, they wouldn't have ended up, it would have been a lot of different individual, maybe regional or, But they wanted, the people who were in favor of a new United States thought, we will be stronger if we do this together. We will be able to fight the British. We will be able to set up our own government. We will be able to have a foreign policy that other countries will respect. We will be able to deal with all the different problems that we've been having within the British Empire better if we do it together. So let's figure out a way to do it together. And the very first thing they say is, we have to take religion off the table, because otherwise it'll just be a non-starter. It won't go anywhere. So they agree to have nothing to do with religion. And the interesting long history of the constitutional amendment is that it changes over time to become the federal government actually defending people's religious liberty, as opposed to just agreeing to step back. Because initially, the amendment is just, we'll step back. Everybody can just do what they want. But over time, it becomes a principle to defend, a founding principle. That is, that everyone should have their freedom to have the religion or no religion at all. And the government gets behind that as a principle, as a policy. Later, after the United States was founded, one of its first treaties was with the Barbary states of northern Africa, in which they went into a commercial military alliance with the countries of the Barbary states. And they stayed in the treaty. The United States states in the opening to that treaty that they have no regard for the religion of other nations. It doesn't matter to them at all. Any religion is fine with them. They're perfectly willing to ally with individuals of other states who want to enter into an arrangement with their new nation. And they explicitly say, it makes no difference to us the fact that you are Muslim, and we are completely open to having an alliance with you and treating you like citizens of the world just the same as we are. So they're very conscious of themselves as representatives of a new nation, that they're trying to make these alliances with other states, and that they want to do so with any group that, is willing to enter into an agreement with them. So they make this very explicit statement in favor of an alliance with an Islamic state very early in their history. So in terms of the scholarship on religious diversity and the separation of church and state, probably the single most important thing that scholars would say about early America is that our popular understanding that people came for religious liberty needs to be modified. Because people came, generally speaking, for their own religious liberty, their own freedom to practice their religion. And the way we talk about that, we make it sound like they came with the idea of, let's create a new society where everyone is free to have their own religion. But as I've tried to point out, that's a process to get from mine to everyone else's. And they do get there in the new United States, but it's not something that starts with stepping off onto Plymouth Rock. When you step off onto Plymouth Rock, you're thinking, I'm here, I can create my own thing, and I can be free to do it. What other people are going to do isn't really concerning you at that point. So this sense that comes from an older historiography, that you get on a boat in England thinking, we're going to create the new United States and separate church and state and guarantee religious liberty. That is a completely false understanding. So that's one important point, to think of it as a process that people work out, and it's not simply religious liberty for everyone from the very first. It's a struggle, and people have to make the case for granting it more broadly and figure out ways to do that. And they do, and it's an important legacy of the early American period that they do, and that they become committed to it. But it's not as if it's easily done. And it continues all through the history of the United States to be something that's a point of struggle, and that has to be refined and addressed with every new generation. So that's one, I think, very important point in the early American historiography. Often scholars try to correct the images of the founders as entirely committed to Christianity. That argument is sort of ill-formed. Most of them were Christians, but most of them were also very open-minded about these religious views. And some of them were not very vigorous as Orthodox Christians either. Somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who cut up the Bible in order to get the parts he thought were legitimate and paste them all together. You know, that's not exactly the image that we have of a Christian nation at its origins. So, having students understand the complexity of their relationship, how they could be by and large Christians and still be dedicated to religious freedom and open to having people who were not Christians be part of the United States is something that we're very much aware of. The need for correcting that impression and having people understand that as much as people today want to take that early history and make it into a Christian nation, that is a change from what was happening at the time. That is not a reflection of what people are trying to do, and doesn't reflect their values. So that's another element of the historiography that people are interested in promoting, thinking about, figuring out how to make an understanding of that more widespread. So those are two of the issues that scholars think about.